Welcome to the Future Media podcast. Now, unless you've been under a rock, you will know that Apple and Google have announced a $1 billion partnership for Google's Gemini AI to power Siri and Apple's intelligence features on the iPhone. Now, the product promise here is that it's going to enhance Siri to make it more conversational, more cool. Kind of AI's or Siri's kind of been in a bit of a coma for the last couple of years while these new conversational chatbots have popped up. But the really big question that lots of people are asking is that it's using Google tech to do this. And that raises a whole series of questions around privacy, monopoly, and consumer choice. Now, Apple, forever, it seems, has marketed itself as a privacy first company, while Google has built a $4 trillion company by harvesting it to run an ad business. It also gives, because of the scale of these two companies, iOS and Google, who've been at kind of loggerheads for years fighting with each other, it basically means that the 76% of the Android market that already is working on Android, which is Google, is now adding to the 27% that iOS controls. So basically 99% of all the world's smartphones will now have Google in its guts. And that raises a whole series of questions. Now, I have a million views, but instead of me sharing all of mine with you, I wanted to share the insights of another expert in this field. So I'm joined today. I'm very delighted. Actually, it's the first time we've actually met in person. So I'm joined by Stephen Nellis, who is Reuters technology correspondent based in San Francisco, who covers Apple and Nvidia and Silicon Valley more broadly. So welcome, buddy. Welcome to the pod.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Ricky. Great to be here and happy to talk about this topic.
The thrill's all mine because I read a lot of your work and I'm really enjoying the kind of the nerding out that's going on at the moment as we're trying to figure out how is this AI big tech dominance future going to play out? And what does it mean for like us, the average guy in the street that's got to go and pay $1,000 for their next smartphone? So I really appreciate you breaking the time for me. So let me ask you this. Let's start at the very beginning. Why is Apple doing this deal with Google? Why? What's behind all this?
Well, I think the simplest explanation is that they have to because Siri sucks. And that is something that, despite Reuters being just the facts and very reporting-based organization, I think there's enough consumer sentiment around that that we can comfortably say that Siri, despite coming out in 2011 and being quite interesting at the time, has not kept pace with what people expect from being able to have a conversation with a piece of technology. And so that's fact number one. Siri's not in step with the times. And fact number two is that AI is a very expensive and difficult game. And it's one that Google in particular has been big on for more than a decade now.
Yeah.
But really, in the past decade, some of the fundamental breakthroughs that actually enabled technologies like ChatGPT are things that were coming out of Google's research organization in 2017, a technology called Transformer. So Apple, frankly, hasn't been investing that much or that long, and they simply can't do what they need to be able to do to make the product they want to make. So the short answer is because they don't have a choice and they had to pick somebody, and it appears that they picked Google for now. And I think that for now is an important piece of the conversation that we should get to a little bit later. But in terms of what this means, it will be a partnership between Apple and Google, but I think it's going to be quite different than some of the other ones that we've seen before. So you might remember the search bar in the phone.
Oh, very much.
Yeah. Exactly, especially if you've been covering the antitrust trial closely. That was an interesting one where the history of that was really, Google. If you can think back this far in time in Silicon Valley history, there was a time when Apple got to the smartphone market and Google wasn't really there. They didn't own Android. It was an open source project that they absorbed and really made a push to get behind. But at that time, in the early days of mobile, Google was looking around and thinking, gosh, all the people are going to phones and that's where the internet's going to live. We want to be the window to the internet. We have to make sure that we have access to those people. So at that time, Apple had this upper hand of having a whole bunch of people who are accessing the internet in a brand new way. Google needed it. Apple made Google pay a lot of money. I think you could fairly say that the tables are now turned, where there's an important technological development that Apple needs. Google has it, and now Apple's got to pay the money to the tune of very credible reporting by our competitors at Bloomberg saying $1 billion a year. So, to a certain extent, that we see this back and forth ping pong ball a lot between big technology companies when they need something and don't have it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And so Apple did have a go at trying to solve this, right? They poached some people from Google to bring them over, very high profile hires, poaches, brought them in, tried really hard. I've written several times over the last 2 years that this is the moment Siri's going to take off. Siri's got this new thing coming. And I've heard at lots of the Apple events that they've got these amazing new projects. They actually put that ad out. Do you remember there was an ad that came out of the actress from Game of Thrones, right? Saying
Right.
it can do this, this, and this, but it couldn't do any of those things at that time. And that was a very un-Apple thing to do, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely. Apple is a company that likes to, under promise and over deliver in general. It's like for listeners who are familiar with the U.S., if you go to Disneyland or Disney World, they'll tell you the line is going to be 10 minutes, but it will only be five, right? And Apple's always had the same approach to that kind of a thing. And yeah, this was a significant miss on Apple's part. And you're also correct about those high profile poaches. John J. Andrea from Google, who is a very high ranking executive that they brought over to fix this. Um, It'll probably take us a few more years reporting yet to figure out just exactly what went wrong and why Apple couldn't
Yeah.
put it together on its own. But I think there are several elements that you can see that are sort of apparent through Apple's history for people who've watched the company closely for a long time. One, and I think this it's fair for debate, but I think there are strains of it that are genuine, which is Apple's aversion to just hoovering up large amounts of data and using it for various things after the fact that it may not have. Disclosed it wanted to use it for when it acquired that data. Something Apple historically hasn't done. I think another thing that Apple has always been more sensitive to than others in Silicon Valley, and this goes back to Steve Jobs and his interface with the music industry, is the rights of intellectual property holders. So, many of the lawsuits that you've seen against OpenAI and Microsoft and others about using copyrighted material to train these models has been something that Apple's historically been cautious about. And then I think the third thing is that Apple has always seen the product at the center of its universe, and that product has always been a device that does the computing largely on the device.
Yeah.
And you've seen this in their history too with music. I think it's fair to say, they really got beat by Spotify and had to play from behind to try to bring a competing service into existence with Apple Music. The same thing happened in lots of other online services like television, right? Where, Netflix and others were way ahead. In AI, by its very nature, this instantation of AI that we're talking about today it is absolutely driven by cloud services in huge piles of computing power inside data centers, and that's historically something that Apple it never focused on a whole lot internally, and even for some of their services that are broad consumer-facing services like Apple Music or Apple Video, is for some of the basic building blocks of those, they contract that out to Google, Amazon, and Microsoft and the cloud computing units of those companies because they've never seen it as a core differentiating thing to own those data centers and build those building blocks themselves. So it's kind of a perfect storm of things that Apple was historically either averse to or not particularly interested in that came together in this. I think the other thing that really, just to put a final pin on it, is much of this research happened out in the open. Right. So the seminal paper that really led to a lot of the chatbots and technologies we see now, Transformers is the name of the technology. That goes back to a paper that Google published in 2017, and it was published openly on the internet. Anybody could, you or I, that we've been smarter, would have gone and read it and raised $100 million and started the next OpenAI. And so a lot of this research, before the big ChatGPT moment in 2022, 2023, was happening in an open source way, which is also something that Apple's historically not been interested in telling the world about what it's doing before it's ready. In fact, it's the exact opposite. So that made it very difficult, I think, for them to recruit. Although they have loosened up on that and they have actually put out some important research. I think another aspect of this is, will they continue to do that to the extent that they did open things up? And we'll have to wait and see whether they'll pare back on that.
So Apple has pretty much been the most valuable company for 2 decades in the world. Yep. Amazing products. I always used to write that, every time I picked up an Apple product, it would surprise and delight me. To your point, it would underpromise and over deliver. And the first time you get that new device, you're like, wow. But it started for me with the iOS updates. You get an iOS update, and there was really nothing new. And then the new phone would come, and it would be, oh, we've got a slightly better definition camera, but that didn't feel like enough. And you're being asked to pay more money for an Apple device than you are for almost anything else. So you've kind of come to expect it to lead from the front and be that much better than everybody else. What it feels like now is that those leaps, those incremental leaps that kept them ahead, are starting to slow. Do you think that's a fair analysis? Do you think this is a company that's perhaps starting to lose a bit of its momentum?
I think the entire technology industry. So this critique is a very common one, and certainly there are a lot of people who've made the same critique. And one of the answers to that critique that you'll hear in Silicon Valley would be, well, what else, right? What other product has come out? Because the constant question with Apple is, what's the next iPhone? And the rebuttal to that would be, well, what's the next iPhone that somebody else put out? And I think you've seen a constant search. If you'll think back to maybe a little more than a decade ago, smart speakers were going to take off. The Internet of Things were going to take off, and those did all become markets. But for various reasons, they never became the kind of blockbuster computing market that smartphones were. And I think that one of the things that makes this moment in AI so interesting is that if you think about some of the reasons that smart speakers fell down, a lot of the brains of the speaker were not that good. If you remember the original Alexa speakers, there was a time when everybody in Silicon Valley thought that the Amazon Alexa speaker would become the next big platform for software developers, and so they published these apps were called Skills on the Alexa speaker. But the problem was the natural language processing capabilities of the technology at the time were really limited. So you would install this Alexa skill on your speaker, and unless you knew how to speak into some kind of magical incantation that was exactly what the developer thought you wanted to say, you would not be able to get the thing to do what you wanted, right? And I think you see that across a lot of technologies that have any other interface other than a screen or a keyboard, right? Where you're directly inputting your thoughts there with taps or typing words. They all suffer from this problem of the AI to understand your intention as a human, not really being ready to create almost any other kind of human user interface other than a screen or a keyboard, both of which were areas where Apple had a very strong play. Um, but that said, I think what's probably got Apple so concerned about this moment is there is emerging a way to squint at this technology. These chatbots right now, you're talking to them in an app, but there's a way to look at this and say, well, wait a minute, things that may not have been very viable before, like a pair of smart glasses that might not have very much room for a display, so they can only tell you a little bit of text at a time or say something in your ear. But if they were really smart, they might be able to do quite a bit. I think the other thing you've seen is there's a company called Humane that was actually founded by some former Apple executives. They started up and the company failed catastrophically and sold for far less money than it raised. But what they were aiming for was this thing called a pin that would sit, as a sort of Star Trek-like badge for people who might know that show, and understand the world around you and interact with it. And I think there are a lot of people that look at that and say, well, a big part of the reason this failed is there are pretty sharp limits to the on-device computing power there, and there are very sharp limits to connectivity. The poor little device basically had to connect directly to the cloud. And anybody who follows tech gadgets or even just uses gadgets a lot knows that if you're constantly taxing your 5G connection to the cloud with a device, you're going to drain your battery very quickly. Now, I think the antitrust argument there would say, well, wait a minute, you have this device in your pocket that has a lot of computing power on it. Why can't you tether to it and harness some of that? And I think that is an interesting antitrust question about to what extent Apple will have to let competing products do that. The EU's got some rules on that with the Digital Markets Act. As yet, the home market in the US doesn't have strict rules around that. But there is no question that Apple has not had anything near the blockbuster success of the iPhone. Some of the products that have been very successful, like these AirPods, are getting interesting AI updates with things like translation. But there hasn't been anything that's knocked it out of the park the way that the original iPhone has.
Well, I think the iPhone is the most successful consumer product in human history. I think I
It
read
is.
recently said you shouldn't really damn them too much. I suppose the question for me is that it feels like Apple's under an incredible internal change, both in a pivot of philosophy, business practice. Maybe it's not the next wonder product. Maybe it's now services on that product. It's you can see there's a lot of adaptation taking place over there. But the one thing it's always been very, very, very strong on is privacy. We are not an advertising product. We do not gather your data to target you with advertising, which marks it out as very different from Google, which is 78% of an advertising, 78% of its revenue is advertising, or Meta, which is 98% of its revenue is advertising. So this raises questions of privacy, right? And so I'm willing to pay here in Australia 13, 14, maybe even $1,600 for an iPhone because it represents something to me. It's got the kudos of being the best in market. It's got the kudos of being a bit more expensive. Therefore, it makes you look a bit more successful, makes you look maybe a little bit smarter. But it also protects my privacy. And that's a very important part of my decision making process in deciding which product to use. I'm actually quite unhappy about the idea that I'm going to effectively be defaulted to a Google product within my iPhone. I was surprised at the antitrust trial that Google had was the default search engine and was paying $20 billion because as soon as I, as a consumer, use Safari and do a search, well, Google knows another little bit about me. So, what do you think this means for privacy? What are the implications for that? And do you think that that's going to lead to continued changes at Apple?
I think privacy is still a core part of the Apple brand, and I do think that the extent to which that continues will very much depend on their ability to continue to essentially make money off of it by having that option in the market. So the devil's really going to be in the details here, as they were actually with that search bar.
Mm,
Technology and partnership. And I think there's an important detail there, which is that we still not every bit of it has been revealed publicly, but based on what we've been able to learn through reporting, one of the features of that deal is that even though you are sending that search through Google, Apple essentially stripped a lot of that data away before your request is sent to Google. So from Google's perspective, they see a big pile of data of requests coming from Apple users, and it's far less data than they would see if you were going directly to Google. So there is that sort of filter there. In part of that is Apple's commitment to privacy, and part of it is, I think, Apple's very strong feeling that these are our users. They are not Google's users. They are not an app developer's users. And so that sort of pugnacious attitude about defending its own users is something that you've seen crop up in other cases against Apple, for example, in some of the App Store antitrust cases and things like that, you've seen this attitude consistently among Apple executives. These are our users, and to whatever extent we send them your way, number one, part of why they chose us is privacy, but number two, it's a favor we're doing to you, and you owe us for this privilege of us sending you the customer. So those are two very distinct attitudes that Apple has that not all other tech companies sort of subscribe to. Um, but how this will play out in the Google case, I think this is where really the devil is going to be in the details. And this is different from both the search integration and even the Chat GPT integration that's already on the iPhone. So one of the things, again, there's still a lot of details
Mm,
that need to be confirmed about this arrangement, but it sounds so far, based on my reporting and the reporting of other colleagues of mine, like Kendrick Kai and our San Francisco office, who covers Google. Um, what we've been able to learn is that this is really the mother of all Google Cloud deals. So Google is a
yes.
very big and complex company itself. Yes, they do make, most consumers are going to know it from that search bar, from the Android operating system and various Google products like Gmail or Google Maps that you might use. But it also has a massive cloud computing business that competes for enterprise business to business contracts against companies like Microsoft and against companies like Amazon Web Services. And everything we've been able to learn about this deal is that it was done through Google Cloud. And that Apple was looking for a core technology provider, considered a number of options and ultimately settled on Google for a number of reasons. One, the quality of the technology, I think. And I think that's, you can see that in people who independently benchmark these models. The Google Gemini models are very, very, very good. Um,
Mm,
but number two, they've got a history of working with Google in these other fields, whether that's a Google Maps integration or the Google search bar integration. So they sort of know the partnership there. But from everything we've learned, this was done through, obviously, Sundar Pichai was involved because it's a huge customer, but was really led by Thomas Kurian, the head of Google's cloud unit, and would be just like any other big Fortune 500 company saying, we need core AI technology services. We need them from somebody. Who are we going to pick in settling on Google? So to a certain extent, it might just it might just be the biggest cloud deal in a long time for Google Cloud. And the question of choice is, there is certainly that aspect here for consumers of what ultimately, and this is where I think the devil will be in the details. Um, if it's everything we understand right now, is that Apple is constructing this so that the core AI service can sort of be swapped out. In other words, they're trying to build a car. They put a really good transmission in it. They like this engine right now, but they want to build the car such that they can swap out the engine at some other point. Right. So at a future date, who knows? Maybe they would use OpenAI. Maybe they use Anthropic, which is another very prominent AI startup. Maybe they would even use Microsoft. I don't know what we do about all those. I'm a Mac, I'm a PC ads, but stranger things have happened in tech. So I think the context is a little different. But to the privacy question, it will really be down to, what steps does Apple take to keep its user data private from whoever it chooses to do this core AI technology work.
amazing. Look, I should let you get back to your reporting, but I do want to just ask one last question that's pertinent to this. So the first thing is that in the antitrust trial, this is the Google search antitrust trial, we learned that there was a very deep relationship between Google and Apple that put the Google search as the default for all Apple devices, and about 20 billion US dollars was changing hands according to the latest number we had, which I think was from 2022. So it's probably gone up since then. And this was found to be a monopoly. And at the end of the trial, one of the judge's decisions, Judge Amit Mehta, one of his decisions was that this deal had to now be negotiated annually, and that other people should be allowed to compete for this space. But onlookers, me included, looked at how much money was changing hands, and you've got Google and you've got Apple, and this is a deal that's worked very well for a lot of years. And there aren't that many other people that can turn up with $20 billion and say, hey, why don't you give us a go? I can't even see OpenAI being able to do that deal. What we've now got is another one of those deals. We've got another one. There's another, I think it's been reported at $1 billion is changing hands on this deal. And the thing that I find really interesting in, and this is what I'm interested in your view on, is that in Apple's accounts, in its own accounts, this relates to about 16% of all of its net profit because it's effectively free money. It's a check with no cost associated with it for a service. Yeah. Apple can't afford to lose 16% of its net profit. It would have an enormous impact on its share price. By making this deal with Google a kind of swap in, swap out deal, might it be that Apple's working its way towards a position where it can have a competitive tendering process for this, do you think? Do you think this is recognizing that this is effectively all profit money? That this is almost a new business line. Is that a fair leap?
I think that they're going to be very careful. So I think that antitrust regulators will look at this, and we will follow those investigations as they come out. They'd be crazy, I think, not to at least take a look and ask questions for documents. However, I think these two things are fairly distinct. In as much as, yes, you are correct with the traffic acquisition deal, which is what that was called at Google. The cost of, for our business listeners out there who are used to thinking of, gross margins and cost of goods sold, the cost of goods for that revenue for Apple was walking down the street and cashing the check.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
so it was very very profitable. In this scenario, the money's flowing the other direction. Apple is going to have to pay Google for these services, and I think that they are. And I think on the backside of that. Um, the services that Google are going to provide are probably not going to be the huge profit engine for Google, because AI is very very expensive to
Yeah,
run. One of the aspects that we're going to look very closely at with this, is where, the inference. In the inference is when you're asking a question of one of these systems and it's responding to you. And to date, Apple has really wanted to run that inference either on your device or in its own special cloud that it's built with Apple designed chips that have similar security features to the ones in your device to try to keep that security profile fairly similar. However, we've now done some reporting of our own and seen some reporting in other places that some of this may run on Google TPUs.
yes,
Um,
I saw that today. I think that just broke today. I just saw
right.
that story a few hours ago.
Right, right. And what we don't yet understand is a couple of things. One, what will Apple do to try to keep that information private? And so remember, Google has this large, sophisticated cloud business, and they're going to work with a number of companies that may have businesses that compete with Google to some extent, who may want to use those TPUs. This is the same at Amazon, in Microsoft, right? If you're a software company, there's no way you don't compete with Microsoft, but you may use some of their cloud services. So all of the cloud services of these, what we call hyperscale technology companies, have some mechanisms built in to keep customer data, for their cloud customers isolated. They wouldn't have cloud businesses if they couldn't do that. So those measures will presumably be in place, and then whatever Apple chooses to layer on top of that, will be a very good question too. But I don't think there's any question that for Google, even if this is a good deal, it won't have the profile near that, near the Apple, the money that was flowing in the other direction, because they would be providing the technology services and cloud computing for this deal. So, the privacy implications are sort of one thing. The antitrust implications are another thing. I think that from Apple's perspective, having covered the company for a number of years and seeing how they deal with suppliers, Google will essentially be a supplier in this case. And Apple is pretty notorious for running a very, very tight ship with its suppliers and looking for how it can save money to increase its margins overall. So my speculation, and we don't speculate at Reuters very often, is that if this is a deal where Apple is sending money out the door to pay for a service, that it will regularly go evaluate whether other people could do it better for cheaper. But the reality of this, from the perspective of the consumer, is that AI is big and expensive. So if Apple were to choose somebody else in the future, it's very likely at Apple's scale that the only kind of partners that would have the sort of just sheer number of data centers to handle the amount of user requests. Think about, installed base of more than a billion Apple devices that will be running Siri. Every time somebody says the two magical words, which I'm not going to say right now because I'm on my phone and it may interrupt our conversation. Um, but every time somebody around the world and those billion plus devices says that could end up going out to one of these servers to be processed. So whoever they pick, it's more than likely going to have to be one of these hyperscale companies that all are American companies at this point. A Microsoft, an Amazon, it may be an OpenAI or Anthropic, but it's probably going to pick from a menu of maybe a half dozen options on a good day, and they're all going to be massive. And at this point, they're all probably going to be based in the U.S. One thing we haven't gotten into that I think is also important to note here is what's going to happen in China. As we've seen, a lot of Apple Intelligence features have been delayed in China. Um, Again, we don't like to speculate, but I would guess that the story will have to be a little different in China because China is very particular about user data and how it gets processed. And the regulatory environment may also evolve. I think that just as we've seen, Europe and Australia take very, very different approaches to social media, which some of those approaches are also being debated in the United States. We may see similar approaches with regard to AI and data processing, and that sort of thing, where it's not inconceivable. It's very conceivable that China would require a local partner to be the technology provider. It's also conceivable that that could one day be the case for other countries as well, which again, I think speaks to why Apple's probably trying to architect this from a technical perspective as something where they're trying to build the car, have a good transmission in there, but have some flexibility to swap out the engine. And the fascinating thing is if you go talk to any of the companies in Silicon Valley right now, that is how almost every major company is trying to architect its AI services, because it's becoming very clear very quickly that one model may be best for one thing this year, one model may be best for another thing next year. Most big businesses that are building up these systems, not just Apple, but any of the businesses that your listeners may be involved in, are probably trying to architect it so that you can swap the engine out at some point. So in that sense, Apple is dealing with the exact same thing that almost anybody running a business and trying to navigate their way through the AI landscape at this point in time is as well.
And Tim Cook is known probably as the world's best supply chain guy, right? So maybe
Right.
he's the right guy to be the CEO at this point. We shall see. Well, look, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. There's going to be a lot of movement in this over time. I think you're absolutely right on the antitrust regulators, by the way. I'm pretty sure they've got their pens out already. So let's see what happens. I want to say thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you taking time from your really busy day, Stephen. It's been amazing.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, buddy. See you later.